Hello and welcome back. In this episode, I want to take you on a journey with portraits. I love portraiture. I think it speaks to our humanness and our identity, and it's such an ancient practice. And I wanted to share some techniques and tips and the process itself. However, as you already know on this channel, it's turned out to be much more. I'm sharing here a little card I got from a local shop, and I'll tell you why it's relevant in a minute. So I picked a model randomly from Pinterest. Mixed media is really my go-to. I love mixing materials and different techniques. But this time I thought about challenging myself a bit and just doing a watercolor portrait, which it was challenging. I have to tell you, watercolors, in my opinion, a very underestimated medium. It is high sophisticated and a little bit unforgiving once the marks are made. There are ways to erase, but it is mostly a process where you layer and layer and layer again until you reach the right consistency or intensity of your pigment, because once it looks darker when you first apply it, but then it will dry and be much lighter. And even though I've used watercolors for many years, I have to say it still brings me a little bit of a challenge. And this was my first epiphany doing this portrait, this idea, this kind of revelation that I really want to be in control, and watercolors just let me know that that's not necessarily the case, when you're making these, but just being in control, period, being in control in our lives, the difference between letting go and letting flow and trying to control everything. So that's probably a lot to discuss on this subject, but just want to share with you this first revelation I had about control and wanting to be controlling in a situation where the medium has its own mind and its own rules, and you better follow. My second epiphany that I want to share with you is that I picked a random model, but I did pick an aged woman of age, you should say, and you can tell that by her skin. And I had an epiphany that I haven't had much experience drawing aged skin. I was a bit unsatisfied, so I decided to go back to the basics and also my original idea for the video, which was to show people kind of loose lines and loose portraiture. And my go-to materials for that are water-soluble graphite, water-soluble crayons, and also just regular markers that are water-based, which takes me back to the idea of controlling your marks, and also going back to something I know pretty well. The next day, I decided to give watercolors one more try. By this time, I realized that none of my portraits look like my original reference model, and that's okay. That was actually one of the points I wanted to share about loose portraiture or loosening up your portraits, is that you can use photo references to get the idea where the shadows are, or the highlights, or maybe just the shape of noses or eyes, but not necessarily making them look exactly realistically like your reference picture. Around this moment, of painting, I realized that it's time to add all of these beautiful wrinkles and skin marks that my model has. And I realized it was quite difficult doing it just by watercolors. So of course my epiphany, and I broke out and brought all my favorite tools like crayons and markers and soft crayons, pastels, to kind of help me along creating this portrait. Sometimes I like to take a little break and pull some cards from my favorite decks. This one happens to come from Louise Hay, and I pulled this card. I thought it was such a great reference to a card I got earlier in the week. And this one brings me to my final epiphany, and it talks about age and being perfect age at this moment and being at peace with age. And I thought how interesting that I decided to draw this aging older model. I often think about aging myself, being in my 40s. It's something that's definitely come up in my life, in my thought process, as a woman. And I know this is a humongous topic that we can talk about it for hours, but this project, making these portraits, unknowingly, I did not intend for this to happen, but this is where I arrived. And I just love art making because of this therapeutic and impactful and definitely spiritual aspects that it has. So here are the final portraits. These are not, my greatest work, I would say, but they're definitely gave me a lot of insights and epiphanies, and I'm so grateful. They definitely do not look like my original model, as I said, but I appreciate them so much for giving me this new ways of looking at things, new insights, new epiphanies. And thank you so much for being here with me, and I will see you next time.